This is long overdue legislation that will explicitly prohibit discrimination against LGBT and gender nonconforming Americans and will strengthen non-discrimination protections for women and others. Today's hearing also affords us the opportunity to hear about the enduring nature and extent of continuing discrimination faced by LGBT people in various aspects of American life. We have an opportunity to continue our march towards justice, to enshrine in our nation's laws protections for marginalized communities, to ensure that they can fully participate in key areas of life, and to provide them recourse in the face of discrimination. By either adding sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity, as a protected characteristic, or where sex is already included as a protected characteristic, by explicitly clarifying that sex discrimination includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. It will also expand the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to clarify the definition of public accommodations and to ensure that a broader range of establishments, including retail stores and services such as banking, are included for all classes. The scaremongering about potential bathroom predators has not turned out to be true. Protecting the ability for a transgender person to use a facility consistent with their gender identity has not weakened public safety or criminal laws or undermined their enforcement. Similarly, protections for sexual orientation and gender identity will not force religious hospitals or nonprofits to close. Many states have sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination laws, and all of them still have women's sports. Arguments about transgender athletes participating in sports in accordance with their gender identity having competitive advantages have not been borne out. Sports have positive impacts on physical, social, and emotional well-being, and we should not be denying transgender athletes those opportunities simply because sometimes they may win. Nor should their occasional success be used as a roadblock to advancing civil rights legislation for LGBT people as a whole. But as a nation, we have long held that we cannot sit by and be tolerant of intolerance that is designed to demean and to exclude communities. I want to take a moment to directly address many of those watching today's hearing who are undoubtedly about to hear their humanity and their right to exist questioned. To the transgender and nonconforming youth, teens, and adults who are about to hear their right to participate in sports and to be themselves in school, work, and in their daily lives challenged. To the same-sex couples who are about to hear suggestions that they just take their business elsewhere, that they adopt children elsewhere, that they exist elsewhere. We see you, we support you, and we believe in you. If you are feeling unsafe, afraid, or at risk, please reach out for help. You are worth fighting for, and we are here to fight alongside you, which is why we will be passing this bill.
I'm the legal director of the National Women's Law Center. The Equality Act would provide explicit protections for LGBTQ people in employment, housing, credit, education, public spaces and services, federally funded programs, and jury service. The act would ensure that all women, including LGBTQ individuals, would gain protections against sex discrimination in public spaces. The act would ensure that individuals gain new protections against sex discrimination by entities that take federal dollars. Schools, community centers, homeless shelters. The Equality Act would prohibit sex discrimination in these spaces. Finally, the act ensures additional protections in public spaces. I want to be clear. The National Women's Law Center supports the act's requirement that transgender women and girls be included with other women and girls in gender-specific spaces, including in sports programs. The National Women's Law Center has represented women and girls seeking athletic opportunities, equal employment, and protection from sexual violence for decades. And this includes women and girls who are transgender. Trans women and girls are women and girls. And in terms of the biology piece, Biology is made up by so many different things, as I understand it, not just external sex organs. There are hormones, there are internal things. And so all of these things make up a person. And so transgender women and girls are women and girls, transgender boys and men are boys and men, as we've heard. And to say that people will go so far as to make up an entire identity, change their pronouns, maybe engage in medical treatment or not, just simply to invade sex-segregated spaces or participate in sports is so outlandish. It's so far-fetched. Yeah, there's no research to support the claim that allowing trans athletes to play on teams that fit their gender identity will create a competitive imbalance. Trans children display the same variation in size, strength, and athletic ability as other youth. And there's no reported instances of a boy pretending to be transgender or presenting as a girl to fraudulently join a sports team.
The Equality Act updates the Civil Rights Act to more fully reflect the way we live our lives today. This amendment to the Civil Rights Act simply modernizes protections that will not only protect me as a transgender man, but my family and many people who I love. I do believe that a person's gender identity is a very personal thing, and it's not something that can be defined by anyone else, and it's definitely not something that anyone wants to perpetrate for the purpose of hurting someone else.
My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I am the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at New York University School of Law. Recent studies have shown that 1 in 5 lesbian, bisexual, and gay individuals, and about 1 in 3 transgender individuals reported unfair treatment in employment decisions. Studies have found no evidence that protecting transgender people from discrimination leads to any increase in safety incidents in gender-segregated bathrooms or locker rooms. Further, trans women athletes have not broadly displaced nor disadvantaged non-trans women and girls when allowed to compete in accordance with their gender identity. Some have argued that sexual orientation and gender identity are distinguishable from protected classifications like race or sex because they are defined partly by conduct rather than by status alone. This distinction is unavailing. Civil rights protections in this nation have never been limited to status alone. Neither religious conduct nor pregnancy are immutable characteristics, yet both are protected. It just strains credulity, Representative, to think that an individual who is undergoing such a deeply personal transformation as to transition away from the gender assigned to them at birth would do so opportunistically simply because they wanted a gold medal in some track meet. This is not about individuals opportunistically trying to take advantage of particular entitlements or benefits that are accorded to women, whether that be in sports, whether that be in small business. It's a deeply, deeply personal issue of identity formation. We hear over and over again trans individuals being cast as the perpetrators of assault and harassment, where statistically there's no evidence that trans individuals are more likely to perpetrate assault or harassment. And in fact, exactly the opposite is true. Trans individuals are much more likely to be the victims of assault and harassment, and that's exactly what the Equality Act would cure.
As I listened to some of you today, I was struck by this push to presume that these provisions would somehow be manipulated or used by people in ways that would hurt existing sex protections. We're talking about fear versus love. We're talking about fear versus freedom.
There is no doubt in my mind that men, women, and children who experience gender dysphoria suffer deeply. Unfortunately, the legislation we're considering would harm countless people who understand themselves to be transgender and would demolish the hard-won rights of women, putting them once again at the mercy of any biological man who identifies at any moment as a woman. The biological differences between the sexes remain scientific and certain. Men are physically stronger and faster than women, which has made it necessary for women to access clear legal protection. When any man can enter into a protected space and status is identifying as a woman, as noted by Women's Liberation Front leader, H.R. 5 nullifies women's and girls as coherent legal category worthy of civil rights protection. H.R. 5 ignores fairness and denies science in order to codify stereotypes and sexism. If a man who adopts the mannerisms associated with women can receive every federal protection afforded to women, we've reduced womanhood to a set of stereotypes. The same stereotypes some men have chronically exploited for social, professional, and political advantage. H.R. 5 could compel doctors to prescribe hormones and perform major surgeries on adolescents based on their gender identity rather than the biological gender or medical condition. Under this bill, adolescents who can't decide what major to pursue in college would be empowered to force doctors bound by anti-discrimination laws to administer hormones that could render these children sterile and conduct irreversible surgeries. Mothers and fathers who have watched their children deteriorate physically and emotionally as they transition away from their biological sex, H.R. 5 erases civil rights protection for biological women and sets the stage for children to fall victim in permanent and unprecedented ways to the confusion that often characterizes adolescence. It automatically privileges the rights of biological men over the rights of biological women.
If the Act passes in its current form as H.R. 5, then every right that women have fought for will cease to exist. H.R. 5 is a human rights violation. Every person in this country will lose their right to single-sex sports, shelters, grants, and loans. The law will forbid ever distinguishing between women and men. To be clear, I do support the general goal of the Equality Act, to protect people on the basis of sex, of physical and immutable biological reality, to protect sexual orientation, which is based on biological sex. I object to the inclusion of gender identity. People who call themselves transgender, non-binary, and everything in between still deserve the same basic human rights that we all do. But treating someone as if they are a member of the opposite sex is not a civil right. In fact, this violates the rights of others. People cannot change sex, no matter how many legal documents they alter, no matter how many dangerous surgeries they endure. This myth of changing sex has gained considerable traction, not only because of the synonymous use of the words sex and gender, but also because trans activism is extremely well-funded, with billionaire donors and a very deep sea of lobbyists. Sex is a vital characteristic, gender and identity are not. Sex can never be changed, but gender changes all the time. There is no way to protect a person on the basis of their gender identity without a legitimate definition. Lawmakers across the country will have to consider which mannerisms, hairstyles, occupations, and clothing choices make up one gender identity or another. Let me tell you what happens if H.R. 5 passes. Male rapists will go to women's prisons and will likely assault female inmates, as has already happened in the UK. Female survivors of rape will be unable to contest male presence in women's shelters. Men will dominate women's sports. Girls who would have taken first place will be denied scholastic opportunity. Women who use male pronouns to talk about men may be arrested, fined, and banned from social media platforms. Girls will stay home from school when they have their periods to avoid harassment by boys in mixed-sex toilets. Girls and women will no longer have a right to ask for female medical staff or intimate care providers, including elderly or disabled women who are at serious risk of sexual abuse. Female security officers will no longer have the right to refuse to perform pat-down or intimate searches of males who say they're female, and women undergoing security checks will no longer have the right to refuse having those searches performed by men claiming a feminine identity. The authors of this bill have done a lot of work to make it sound like gender identity is well understood and has been around for a long time, but it's a new concept that can only ever refer to stereotypes and unverifiable claims. There is no evidence of a gender identity. It's not a material reality at all. There is also the myth of assault being higher for people who identify as transgender. The rate of murder for transgender identified individuals is 1.5 per 100,000. That's lower than the murder rates of both men and women. So this data shows that people who self-identify as transgender are murdered at a lower rate than general population. Sexual orientation is not the same thing as gender identity. These two things are very different, and in fact, one invalidates the other.
My name is Dorianne Coleman. I'm a professor of law at Duke Law School. The argument is that because some males identify as women, some women have testes. From this, it follows that sex and sex-linked traits can't be the grounds for distinctions on the basis of sex because this excludes women with testes. This leaves gender identity as the only legitimate basis for classifying someone into, for example, girls' and women's only spaces and opportunities. Sex is not just a concept. Females have and continue to be treated differently precisely because of our reproductive biology and stereotypes about that biology. The legal fiction that females and women with testes are the same for all purposes will take us backward, not forward. Beyond dispute that males and females are materially different with respect to the main physical attributes that contribute to athletic performance. The very best women in the world would lose to literally thousands of boys and men, including to thousands who would be considered second tier in the men's category. And because it only takes 3 male-bodied athletes to preclude the best females from the medal stand, it doesn't matter if only a handful turn out to be gender nonconforming.
It doesn't seem fair for men who identify as a woman to be able to take advantage of certain government contracts, because doing so allows them to utilize the women-owned small business federal contracting program, for example, which is designed to provide greater access to federal contracting opportunities for women-owned small businesses.
I've heard about women who they seem to have more post-traumatic stress disorder from sexual assault, and yet we're going to force them to have men in confined spaces in shelters where they're seeking a refuge away from men inflicting violence on them. And because we're going to stand up here and say, well, it's just too bad, we're going to force men to be into your spaces and you're going to have to like it, I think is a war on women that should not be allowed.
I believe that all people should be treated equally, but I'm concerned that H.R. 5, with the weight of federal law, forces schools, prisons, shelters, etc., to prioritize the rights of biological males over that of biological women. H.R. 5, in the vast number of settings covered, will require that men be allowed to enter space formerly reserved for women.
Let me read from the text of the bill. It says, the term gender identity means the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual. The drafters of this bill could have saved themselves some legalese and just said gender identity means gender stereotypes. What does that say about this movement that the lawyers drafting this bill are unable to define gender identity without relying on stereotypes?